Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating set of observations you've shared, exploring a pretty striking perspective on politics in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, the core idea running through this material is what they call a cult of politics. It's this viewpoint that argues, a really rigid attachment to ideology is affecting almost everything.
Everything from how government works or doesn't work, to personal relationships, even infrastructure. Right.
Exactly. So our mission today is really to unpack this specific viewpoint, understand the claims it's making, look at the examples it gives, and explore the consequences it suggests come from this intense ideological focus.
Okay, let's get into it then.
So at the heart of it, this material makes a pretty stark claim that politics today, doesn't matter which party, demands absolute, total agreement with the party line, with the ideology.
No room for disagreement at all.
That's what this perspective argues, yeah. Disagreement just isn't tolerated. It suggests that if you see something you think is wrong and you actually speak up,
Then you face a choice.
a very clear one, according to this source. Either you fall back in line, get with the program, and you're applauded for it, or if you don't, you're basically ostracized.
Okay, ostracized. That sounds pretty severe.
Yeah.
How does this source say that actually happens? What's the process look like?
Well, this viewpoint, it lays out what it sees as a predictable sequence of events. It claims it unfolds the same way every single time someone steps out of line.
Okay, so what are the steps?
First, it's claimed they take a public stance against you, using TV, newspapers, that kind of thing.
So it starts out in the open.
Yeah, and then, according to this, they just stop talking to you, like completely ignore you.
Wow. Public and then personal shenning.
Right. And it apparently escalates from there. The source claims threats might start to surface.
Threats. Seriously.
That's the claim. And then this viewpoint says you get commentators, newscasters on TV starting to make jokes about you, maybe calling you names, that sort of thing.
The public ridicule phase.
Exactly how this perspective frames it. And it apparently goes even further. The source claims that once the TV stations figure they can't get ratings by, just mocking you anymore.
They just drop you.
Yeah. The description is pretty blunt, thrown away like a piece of garbage, never mentioned again. And the final step, this viewpoint argues, is the complete destruction of your character.
Man, that is a grim picture of political life. And the source contrasts this with how things supposedly used to be, right?
Yeah, this part's fascinating. It describes politics back in the day, suggesting politicians from different parties actually, interacted, had real conversations, played sports together.
Shared meals, went to parties together, even in Congress.
That's the picture it paints, which according to this material is just worlds away from now. It claims everyone sticks rigidly to their own side. Debates in Congress, described as just yelling parties.
So Congress is kind of a symbol of this whole shift in the political class, according to this view.
That's how the source presents it, yeah.
Yeah.
A key example.
Okay, so if politicians aren't even having civil conversations, what's the big consequence here? What does this viewpoint argue happens because of this?
Well, connecting the dots, the source claims this means nothing serious is being done to change what's happening in the country. It argues Congress's role gets kind of reduced to just maintenance. Keeping the lights on, renewing necessary stuff, but not really innovating or finding new solutions.
And this perspective doesn't just blame the politicians, does it? It seems like it puts a lot of focus on the voters, too.
Oh, absolutely. It makes a very strong claim here. It argues voters are like the engine that's actually driving this whole thing.
How so?
This perspective suggests voters are choosing based on ideology, what makes them feel good, what appeals emotionally, not based on competence or track record or what a candidate has actually accomplished.
So if a candidate says the right ideological things,
Boom, they get the votes, is the claim. Regardless of what you have done. And this devotion, it argues, goes way beyond just voting.
yeah, the source gives some really striking examples of voter behavior, doesn't it?
It really does. This perspective claims voters aren't just like voting. They're willing to do pretty much whatever the leader or candidate asks, like donations, for example.
Even if they're rich.
Yeah, it claims even very wealthy people, if asked by a candidate they align with ideologically, will just give money generously.
And it contrasts that with indifference to other kinds of suffering.
Right. The source specifically contrasts it with seeing someone, say, dying of hunger, for whom it claims these same people will do nothing. It's the ideological connection that motivates the action. in this view.
And what about those behavioral examples, the bumper stickers and stuff?
Yeah, it points to things like the sheer number of bumper stickers you see, sometimes years after an election, political messages on T-shirts, hats.
Buying merchandise,
Yeah.
mugs and things?
Exactly. Even if their house is full, they'll buy the mug, buy the object. And this viewpoint suggests it's ongoing, they'll keep buying. And if asked for more money, they'll just keep donating.
Wow. It sounds like this intense focus is really spilling over into personal lives, causing real damage.
The source lists a whole range of consequences it attributes to this political division. Things like fighting with neighbors, just over politics, refusing to eat with family members.
Separating from spouses or partners, losing jobs.
Yeah, all of that. Avoiding parents during holidays, ending business deals, stopping books from being published, movies getting canceled, even closing bank accounts all. This perspective claims because of political views or activities.
That is an incredibly high personal cost. And the source explicitly calls this a cult of self-destruction, right?
It does. And it stresses this viewpoint sees this happening on both sides. Doesn't matter if you identify as Republican or Democrat.
It argues things weren't always like this.
Yeah, it suggests that not too long ago, there was more agreement on, basic national good, and people voted on issues that mattered broadly. Now, according to this source, it's mainly about what makes people happy in terms of ideology.
So, okay, it lays out this problem, this cult. What does this viewpoint suggest is the root cause? How did things get this way?
Well, the idea presented is that maybe wealthy individuals got a bit too comfortable trying to influence politics, and politicians trying to get voters excited
Promised too much.
kind of fell into their own trap, is the claim, made too many promises they maybe couldn't keep. And now this perspective suggests they're stuck in this cycle, trying to get out by making more promises, breaking them, and just hoping enough time passes that people forget.
And this isn't just like a theory. The source then points to very concrete, practical examples across different areas to show how this cult of politics impacts everyday stuff. Let's start with infrastructure.
Yeah, this viewpoint makes a really bold claim here. It says if you want to find major federal infrastructure projects, you basically have to go back to FDR or maybe Eisenhower.
And it's not because our infrastructure is, perfect now.
Not at all, according to the source. It says everyone knows it needs massive improvement, replacement, development. But instead, you see things like bridges collapsing with buses on them.
It mentions New York City specifically.
Yeah, as a stark example, it says you don't need to be an expert engineer to see elevated subway platforms rusting away, or concrete literally crumbling off, showing the rusted rebar inside.
And the core argument here is, despite these obvious failures,
The politicians, regardless of party, are described as being still fine. People, this viewpoint claims, aren't demanding better conditions anymore. The focus is just on electing someone with the right ideology.
okay, moving to another really basic area, food and nutrition.
Yeah, this material makes another very strong claim that the U.S. has the worst mass-produced food and nutrition standards globally. It specifically points to chemicals used in processed foods here that are apparently banned almost everywhere else.
And why isn't this a bigger issue, according to this source?
Because it claims this is not what matters to those people, meaning it's not an ideological priority, so nobody really cares enough to do anything about it.
And the consequence they see?
The source argues you can see the effects in, public health, weight issues, disease rates, but it claims those voters do not care even if it's directly harming them. It's just not part of the ideological fight.
Wow. Okay, public transportation is another big one that tackles.
Right. The claim here is the system is so unreliable that most people just drive their own cars if they can.
Which is a shift from the past.
Yeah, the source mentions things like omnibuses, ferries, trains, subways, suggesting public transport used to be way more central to how people got around. Now, this viewpoint argues if you don't have a car, you're often seen as unreliable for jobs because transit is just bad pretty much everywhere in the U.S.
And it describes current transit as dirty, unsafe, never on time. Yet politicians get reelected.
Yeah, like nothing is wrong is the phrase used. And this ties right back to that ideological alignment idea. This perspective argues mayors, city councils, they get reelected because their ideology satisfies the voters, not their actual performance delivering services.
And this lack of reliable transit really hits people in poverty hard, doesn't it?
That's a key point this viewpoint makes. If you can't afford a car and the public transit doesn't work well, it's incredibly hard to, improve your situation, get to better jobs, move out of poverty.
It uses specific city examples for this too, right? Like New York again.
It does. Contrasting Manhattan, which it says has better stations and trains, with parts of Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, where it describes the infrastructure as crumbling, dirty, mentioning urine, rats, even human waste, and unsafe.
But the politicians stay in power.
Because, this perspective claims, voters are happy with their ideology. Performance doesn't matter as much.
And Minneapolis-St. Paul, that was an interesting example.
Yeah, that one's really striking. It acknowledges they have conceptually good infrastructure connected light rail and buses, but then it claims the city officials, district attorneys, they release people arrested for bad behavior on the platforms.
Like drug use or assault.
Right. Often without even charging them, according to the source, which means they can apparently just come right back and do it again.
So the result is?
That these potentially great train systems become abused, smelly, damaged, and people stop using them.
And it says Dallas and other cities have similar issues.
Yeah, and what's really emphasized is the contrast it draws with private companies. You know, a private train company has to make a profit. That means investment, accountability. If the CEO doesn't perform, the board fires them.
Whereas elected officials,
Even if they're not doing a great job on service delivery, this source claims they just get reelected based on ideology.
and even basic service stuff like weekend schedules or maintenance.
Gets ignored, according to the source. It points out things like weekend service being maybe only once an hour, or doing major maintenance during the day on weekends, causing huge delays when people need to get to work.
Which seems inefficient.
Yeah, this viewpoint finds it illogical, suggesting work that causes an hour delay between stations could easily be done overnight when fewer people are riding.
Okay, then it shifts to housing, another area where practical problems get pushed aside.
That's the argument. The claim is you can't even have a serious debate about practical solutions like, say, rent freezes. It doesn't matter how many people are homeless or how fast rents are rising.
And why not? Back to the cult.
Exactly. According to this viewpoint, things like rising rents or homelessness aren't framed as ideological problems for the voters or the candidates. So talking about them offers no political advantage in this system.
Wealth creation, manufacturing. Same pattern.
Pretty much. The source asks, why aren't officials trying harder to get investment in things like mineral extraction or manufacturing, especially when counties need the tax revenue?
And the answer, according to this perspective,
Is that it just doesn't register. It doesn't concern voters, candidates, or officials because it's not part of the dominant ideology they care about.
it even mentions the rhetoric about bringing manufacturing back.
Yeah, it calls that nice rhetoric, makes people feel good, sounds good in speeches, across the political spectrum, actually. But then this viewpoint claims nothing is done further.
Even for basic things.
It uses the example that even toilet paper is mostly imported.
And this ties into a bigger point about the U.S. economy's structure.
Right. This viewpoint argues the economy is heavily reliant on services now. People go to college, it says, mainly for service sector jobs, not for making physical things.
But services need goods.
Exactly. The source makes the point that services are nothing without the underlying goods. Tech companies need computers and phones, which often aren't made here. If people can't afford the hardware or even the network signal.
Demand for the service drops, affecting those companies, potentially jobs.
Yeah, but again, according to this perspective, these kinds of fundamental economic issues.
They aren't seen as social issues in the ideological sense, so.
So no one cares, is the blunt conclusion of this viewpoint.
Okay, so pulling all these different threads together, infrastructure, food, transit, housing, manufacturing, the source's main point seems pretty clear.
Yeah, this viewpoint basically concludes that no matter where you look, whatever sector you examine, you find the same underlying issue. This cult of politics pollutes everything.
And because, according to this source, everything kind of runs on politics. If politics itself is gridlocked by ideology.
Then this perspective argues nothing really meaningful gets done about any of these practical, real-world problems.
So we've taken a deep dive into this specific perspective, one that argues U.S. politics has become, well, extremely rigid, driven more by ideological loyalty than by practical problem-solving or, accountability for results.
Yeah, this viewpoint paints a picture where this intense focus on ideology affects just about everything. How politicians deal with each other, how voters behave, and how the country tackles really critical everyday issues. Infrastructure, health, transport, housing, the economy.
It certainly suggests that this focus on ideological alignment across the board is actively stopping real action. And as the source claims, it's even damaging people's personal lives pretty badly. Which, yeah, Here's where it gets really interesting.
So what does this all mean then? If this viewpoint is accurate, if this ideological gridlock really does prevent discussion and action on vital stuff, and it reduces accountability, what are the ways forward? How do you address these huge national challenges the sources outline?
It really raises a big question, doesn't it? If a system is described as being driven mainly by making people ideologically happy rather than by delivering actual tangible results,
Mm,
how could a system like that possibly, course correct? How does it start addressing the practical needs and the problems that these sources detail?
Definitely something to think about until our next deep dive.